What kind of man builds a home, before he even finds a wife? No romance, no promises, just an offer. Work with me, struggle with me, and maybe something real will grow. But in a land where survival comes first, can love truly come later? Real love isn't found, it's built. On this channel, we bring you stories of the Wild West, love, sacrifice, family, and the quiet strength between people. If this story speaks to you, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The scent of fresh pine boards and 2 years of sweat still clung to Elias Vance's calloused hands. But today, he smelled only of bay rum and anticipation. He pulled back on the reins, bringing the pair of matched bays to a gentle halt in front of the Dust Creek post office. Behind him sat a brand-new wagon, its wooden-spoked wheels painted a cheerful crimson. The seat padded with a thick woven blanket he'd bought off a Navajo trader 3 months prior. It wasn't just a wagon. It was a carriage meant for a bride. For 2 grueling years, Elias had driven cattle through blizzards, hammered nails until his knuckles bled, and lived on hardtack and black coffee. Every swing of the hammer, every corral post sunk into the unforgiving earth of the Colorado Territory, had been for the woman waiting at the end of a 2-year trail of ink and paper, Clementine Sterling. The woman who had promised him her hand, sight unseen, based on the meeting of their minds across hundreds of miles. He adjusted the lapels of his only good suit, brushed the prairie dust from his Stetson, and stepped onto the boardwalk. The wood groaned under his heavy boots. He was a man who built things to last, and today he was building his family. He pushed open the door of the post office. The little bell above the frame chimed a bright, tinny welcome, but the room itself was swallowed in a stifling, heavy silence. The front desk was empty. The mail slots behind the wire mesh were stuffed with uncollected envelopes. "Hello?" Elias called out, his deep voice rattling the glass of the front window. "Mr. Sterling? Clementine?" A shuffling sound came from the back room, followed by the soft thud of a ledger dropping. A woman emerged from behind the partition, but it wasn't the golden-haired beauty depicted in the small tintype Elias carried in his breast pocket. It was Josephine. Jo, the older Sterling sister. Elias remembered her vaguely from his few visits to town to buy supplies. She was always fading into the background, a smudge of ink on her cheek, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. Today, however, her face was pale, her shoulders slumped under a faded gingham dress, and her eyes were rimmed in a harsh, raw red. "Vance," Jo said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her fingers gripped the edge of the wooden counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Miss Jo," Elias tipped his hat politely, though a knot of unease began to tighten in his gut. "I've come for Clementine. The train from Denver got in an hour ago, and her letter said she'd be waiting here. We've got an appointment with the Reverend at noon." Jo closed her eyes. A single shuddering breath racked her thin frame. When she opened them again, the absolute devastation in her dark eyes made Elias take a step back. "She isn't here, Elias." "Did she go to the church early?" he asked, trying to force a smile he didn't feel. "She's gone," Jo said flatly, the words dropping like stones on the wooden floor. "She took the 4 a.m. freight train heading west, to San Francisco." Elias stared at her, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner suddenly deafening. "That's not a funny joke, Jo. I sent her $300 last month for her trousseau and the final arrangements." "I know." Jo's voice broke. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small velvet pouch, empty, and a crumpled train schedule. "She left this. She took the money, Elias, all of your money, and what little savings my father had left in the lockbox. She went with a gambling man named Silas Thorne. They've been seeing each other in secret for months. The air left Elias's lungs. The sturdy foundation of the future he had built over the last 730 days cracked and splintered in an instant. The house with the wide porch, the kitchen with the west-facing window. It had all been for a ghost, a liar. A cold, dark fury began to simmer in his chest, hardening his jaw. "She took my money," he growled, the soft anticipation in his voice entirely gone, replaced by the dangerous rumble of a man who had survived the frontier through sheer grit. "And she made a fool of me. 2 years of letters, 2 years of promises." He turned on his heel, ready to walk out, ready to ride his horse into the ground until he caught that train. "She didn't write the letters." The words stopped Elias dead in his tracks. His hand hovered over the brass doorknob. He slowly turned back around, his blue eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "What did you say?" Joe stepped out from behind the safety of the counter. She was trembling, but her chin was held high, meeting his furious gaze with a terrifying vulnerability. "Clementine hated writing," Joe said, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "She read your first letter and laughed at it. Said you sounded like a dirt-poor dreamer. She was going to throw it in the stove." Elias felt a physical ache in his chest. But the replies... The woman who wrote back to me knew about the poetry of Lord Byron. She told me to plant lilacs by the porch because the scent keeps the mosquitoes away. He swallowed hard. "She told me she loved the idea of the west-facing window over the sink so she could watch the sunset while washing the supper dishes." Joe took a step closer, her hands clasped tightly together. Ink stains, deep and permanent, marred the tips of her fingers. "The porch needs to be exactly 6 feet wide to catch the evening breeze without letting the afternoon sun bake the front room," Joe recited, her voice trembling but her gaze unwavering. "And the hearth. You said you used river stones from the creek, the ones smoothed by 1,000 years of water, because you wanted a fire that felt like it had always belonged there." Elias's breath hitched. He had never told another living soul those details. He had only ever written them down by the flickering light of a campfire, pouring his soul into the ink. He stared at the quiet, unadorned woman standing before him. The ink on her fingers, the intelligence burning behind her tired eyes. "It was you," Elias whispered, the betrayal taking on an entirely new, agonizing shape. "You wrote the letters." "I am so sorry," Joe choked out, the tears falling freely now. "I only meant to write back once, to let you down easy. But then I read your words, and I couldn't stop. For 2 years, Elias, I couldn't stop." Elias stood in the suffocating silence of the post office, the crimson wagon waiting uselessly outside. The woman he had built his dream home for was gone, but the soul he had fallen in love with was standing right in front of him, and she was the greatest liar he had ever met. The silence in the post office stretched so taut it threatened to snap. Elias stared at Josephine Sterling, trying to reconcile the drab, ink-stained woman before him with the vibrant, poetic soul who had kept him tethered to sanity through 2 brutal Colorado winters, the woman who had written about the migratory patterns of red-tailed hawks and the specific shade of purple the mountains turned at dusk. It was her. The realization was a heavy stone dropping into the pit of his stomach. "You lied to me," Elias stated, his voice devoid of the raging fury he expected to feel, replaced instead by a cold, hollow ache. "I protected my sister," Joe replied, her chin trembling but her spine rigidly straight. "At first. And then I found a friend. I am deeply sorry for the deception, Mr. Vance. I will work to repay the $300 Clementine stole, even if it takes me the rest of my life." Before Elias could formulate a response, the front door of the post office crashed open, the glass pane rattling dangerously in its wooden frame. A heavy-set man stumbled over the threshold, bringing with him the sour stench of cheap whiskey and unwashed wool. It was Hiram, Joe's stepfather. His face was flushed a mottled, angry red, his sparse hair sticking up in wild tufts. "Where is she?" Hiram bellowed, his bloodshot eyes sweeping the empty room before settling on Joe. "Where is that useless, golden-haired little harlot?" Joe instinctively took a step back, her hands flying to the edge of the counter. "She's gone, Hiram. She took the early train west." Hiram's face contorted into an ugly sneer. He lunged forward, slamming his meaty hands onto the counter. "Gone? What do you mean, gone? She was supposed to marry this dirt-scratcher today and leave us a dowry. Mayor Higgins is expecting his payment by sundown, Josephine. If Clementine ran off, who is going to cover the debt?" "She took the lockbox, Hiram," Joe said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "She took everything." The older man froze. A terrifying stillness washed over him, followed by a sudden violent outburst. He reached across the counter, his thick fingers grabbing a fistful of Joe's faded gingham dress near the collar. "Then Higgins will take you," Hiram spat, his breath foul in her face. "He's been eyeing you anyway, plain as you are. You'll clean his floors and warm his bed until every last red cent of my gambling debt is paid off. Get your things." Joe gasped, struggling against his grip, her hands clawing at his thick wrists. "No! Hiram, please! You can't! Let her go!" The words weren't shouted, but the low, deadly gravel in Elias's voice cut through the air like a bullwhip. Hiram blinked, seemingly noticing the tall rancher standing mere feet away for the first time. Elias didn't move fast. He didn't have to. He simply stepped closer, the sheer breadth of his shoulders and the unyielding set of his jaw radiating a quiet, lethal promise. He placed one large, calloused hand over Hiram's wrist. He didn't squeeze, but the implication of the strength coiled beneath his scarred knuckles was unmistakable. "I said, let the lady go," Elias repeated, his ice-blue eyes boring into Hiram's bloodshot ones. Hiram swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating under the icy stare of a man who wrestled steers and broke wild horses for a living. He released Joe, stumbling back a step. "This is family business, Vance. You don't have a bride here anymore. Ride on." Elias looked at Joe. She was rubbing her collarbone, taking shallow, terrified breaths. A bruise was already beginning to form where Hiram had grabbed her. Elias looked back at the drunken tyrant, then down at his own dusty boots. The gears in his mind, usually slow and deliberate, began to turn with desperate speed. He had ridden into Dust Creek to claim a wife. He needed one. The Homestead Act required him to prove up on his land, and the local land agent, a stickler for the rules, had made it clear that a single man holding 160 acres of prime grazing land with a creek running through it was highly suspicious. Elias had filed his final paperwork under the pretense that he was building a home for his new bride. Without a marriage certificate to file by the end of the month, a rival outfit down the valley, the Bar K, would contest his claim and swallow his land whole. He needed a Mrs. Vance. And the woman standing behind the counter, the one who had lied to him, the one who knew the exact dimensions of his hearth and the layout of his dreams, needed a way out. "Hiram," Elias said slowly, his eyes never leaving Joe's face. "You owe Mayor Higgins how much?" $200, Hiram muttered, eyeing Elias suspiciously. Elias reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He had brought extra cash for the journey back, funds meant for celebratory dinners and hotel stays. He pulled out a thick wad of greenbacks and tossed them onto the wooden counter. They landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "There's 250. Pay the mayor. Keep the change for your silence. Josephine isn't going anywhere with Higgins." Elias turned fully to face Joe, the air crackling between them. "She's coming with me." Joe's eyes went wide. "Elias, I don't—" "Listen to me, Josephine," Elias interrupted, his tone devoid of any romantic inflection. It was the voice of a man negotiating the price of winter feed. "You owe me $300, and you just cost me a wife. I have a ranch that needs tending, cattle that need branding, and a land agent who expects to see a marriage certificate on his desk by Friday." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear over Hiram's greedy shuffling of the bills. "I am offering you a business arrangement, a legal marriage. You come to my ranch, you cook, you keep the books. I know you're good with numbers from your letters, and you help me hold my claim. In return, I offer you my name, a roof over your head, and protection from the likes of him." He jerked his head toward Hiram. Jo stared at him, her chest heaving. "A marriage of convenience." "A bargain between two desperate people," Elias corrected grimly. "I won't touch you, Jo. I won't ask for a husband's rights. You get a sanctuary. I get to keep my land. Do we have a deal?" It wasn't a proposal born of love. It was a lifeboat tossed into a stormy sea. Jo looked at Hiram, who was already turning toward the door, clutching the money like a lifeline, entirely unconcerned with her fate. She looked at the cramped, dusty post office where she had spent the best years of her youth fading into the wallpaper. And then she looked at Elias Vance, betrayed, furious, yet offering her the only honorable escape she would ever get. "Yes," Jo whispered, the single word sealing her fate. "I agree." An hour later, Reverend Miller stood in the dusty parlor of his home, nervously adjusting his spectacles. The ceremony was painfully brief. There were no flowers, no music, no blushing bride. Just Elias standing rigid in his suit, and Jo wearing her only decent dress, a navy blue cotton gown she wore to church on Sundays. "Do you, Elias Vance, take this woman?" When the time came for the rings, Elias hesitated. He pulled out a delicate gold band from his vest pocket, a ring he had bought with Clementine's delicate, unworked fingers in mind. He slid it onto Jo's left hand. It stopped at her knuckle, too small to pass over the joints swollen from years of hauling mail bags and scrubbing floors. A flash of profound humiliation crossed Jo's face. Elias felt a sudden sharp pang in his chest. Without a word, he took the ring back, slipped it into his pocket, and instead took her bare hand in his. His rough palm enveloped hers completely. "With my name, I thee wed," he muttered, improvising, his thumb lightly brushing the ink stains on her fingertips. "I pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend said hurriedly. "You may, well, you are married." They didn't kiss. They walked out of the parsonage and climbed onto the crimson wagon. Elias took the reins, snapped them over the horses' backs, and the newly minted Mr. and Mrs. Vance rolled out of Dust Creek without looking back, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words between them. The Colorado plains did not care about broken hearts or marriages of convenience. They were vast, indifferent, and punishing. For 3 days the wagon rattled over sun-baked earth, cutting through oceans of pale green sagebrush and dried buffalo grass. Elias drove in silence, the brim of his hat pulled low against the glaring sun. He watched his new wife out of the corner of his eye. He expected tears. He expected complaints about the dust coating her clothes, the jarring bumps of the trail, or the sheer, terrifying isolation of the open frontier. Clementine would have complained. Clementine would have demanded they stop at every settlement for a proper bed and a hot bath. Josephine did not complain. When the wagon hit a particularly vicious rut on the second afternoon, snapping a leather trace on the left bay horse, Elias swore under his breath and jumped down to inspect the damage. It was a tedious, dirty job that would require splicing the thick leather with awl and twine. Before he could reach for his saddlebags, Jo was already beside him. She hadn't asked for permission. She had simply climbed down, retrieved his leather-working kit from the back of the wagon, and handed him the heavy needle. "Hold the two ends together," she instructed quietly, her voice hoarse from the dust. "I'll pull the twine through. It'll go faster." Elias blinked, startled. He did as he was told, pressing the thick leather straps together. Jo leaned in, her brow furrowed in concentration. She smelled of lye soap, dust, and something uniquely her own, like dried lavender and old paper. Her hands were deft and strong, pushing the needle through the tough hide with an efficiency that surprised him. "Where did you learn to do that?" Elias asked, his voice a low rumble. "Father's mail bags tore all the time," Jo replied, not looking up. "He was too drunk to fix them, and new ones cost money we didn't have. You learn to mend what's broken, Mr. Vance, or you lose what you carry." Elias stared at the top of her head, her dark hair coated in a fine layer of prairie dust. "You learn to mend what's broken." The words echoed in his mind long after the trace was fixed, and they were back on the road. The woman sitting beside him was a stranger, yet he knew the deepest corners of her mind. He knew she feared thunderstorms but loved the smell of the rain. He knew she preferred coffee black and believed Shakespeare's comedies were vastly inferior to his tragedies. He had married a stranger who knew his soul. It was maddening. On the afternoon of the third day, the landscape finally shifted. The flat plains began to roll and heave, rising into the foothills of the Rockies. The air grew cooler, carrying the crisp scent of pine needles and snowmelt. Elias urged the horses over the crest of a ridge. "Whoa," he called softly, pulling back on the reins. The wagon rolled to a stop. Below them, cradled in a lush green valley, lay the Vance ranch. A winding creek cut through the center like a ribbon of silver. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and sitting on a gentle rise, overlooking it all, was the house. Jo gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a small, choked sound. It wasn't a crude, sod-roofed shack like most bachelor claims. It was a two-story structure built of thick golden pine logs. A wide, sweeping porch wrapped around the front, supported by sturdy cedar posts. A massive chimney made of smooth gray river stones anchored the side of the house. It was exactly down to the very last detail, the house they had built together in their letters. "Elias," Jo breathed, her voice cracking. You actually built it." "I told you I would," Elias said gruffly, though his chest swelled with a fierce protective pride. He clicked his tongue, driving the wagon down the incline and into the dooryard. As soon as the wagon stopped, Jo scrambled down before he could offer his hand. She walked toward the porch as if drawn by an invisible string. She ran her hand over the rough-hewn cedar posts, tracing the grain of the wood. She looked at the empty space beside the steps. "The lilacs," she whispered. "Planted them last fall," Elias said, coming up behind her. "They're just bare twigs now, but they should bloom next spring, assuming the frost doesn't take them." Jo turned the brass doorknob and pushed the heavy oak door open. The inside smelled of fresh sawdust, wood smoke, and linseed oil. The main room was vast, dominated by the massive stone hearth. But Jo didn't linger in the parlor. She walked straight toward the back of the house, her boots echoing on the wide plank floors. She stepped into the kitchen. It was simple, furnished with a heavy wooden table and an iron stove. But over the deep porcelain sink, framed by sturdy pine trim, was a large square window. The sun was just beginning its descent, behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, pouring a river of liquid gold and fiery orange directly through the glass, bathing the entire kitchen in a warm, ethereal glow. The west-facing window. Jo stood in front of it, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. She stared out at the sunset, her shoulders beginning to shake. A single sob tore from her throat, followed by another. She pressed her face into her hands, crying with a quiet, devastating intensity. Elias stood in the doorway, paralyzed. He was used to the harsh realities of the frontier. Broken bones, frozen calves, the unforgiving weather. He knew how to fix those things. He didn't know how to fix the weeping woman in his kitchen. He took a hesitant step forward. "Jo, I'm sorry it's not finished. I still need to build the cabinets, and—" "Don't," Jo interrupted, turning around. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were shining with an emotion Elias couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness. It was awe. "Don't apologize. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. You listened to every word I wrote." "I listened to the woman I thought was my wife," Elias said, the words slipping out harsher than he intended. He saw the light in Joe's eyes extinguish instantly, replaced by the familiar, guarded look she had worn in the post office. Elias cursed himself inwardly. He had spent 2 years pouring his heart out to this woman, and now that she was standing in his kitchen, bathed in the light of the window she had dreamed of, he couldn't let go of the anger. The betrayal was still too fresh, the wound too raw. He hardened his jaw and took a step back, rebuilding the wall between them. "I'll bring your trunk in," Elias said coldly, his tone strictly business. "There's a cot in the parlor corner. You can sleep there until I can build a partition. I'll take the loft. Supper is usually at sundown. Tomorrow I'll show you how the stove works." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Joe standing alone in the golden light of the west-facing window. The bargain was struck. They were sharing a house, but as Elias hauled her battered trunk up the porch steps, he knew they were further apart than when they had been separated by 300 miles of frontier dirt. A month on the Colorado frontier could age a man a year, and it could break a woman in a week. Elias Vance had fully expected to spend his evenings listening to the muffled weeping of a city-bred woman terrified by the howling wind and the bone-deep isolation. He had braced himself for ruined suppers, complaints about the alkaline water, and the inevitable realization that his home was a prison for a reluctant bride. But Josephine was no fragile hothouse flower. She was a deep-rooted prairie rose, blooming quietly in the harsh dirt. The first 2 weeks passed in a rigid, polite dance of avoidance. Elias would wake before dawn, slipping down from the loft while Joe still slept on the narrow cot in the parlor corner, her dark hair a stark contrast against the white pillowcase. He would light the stove, put the coffee on to boil, and escape into the freezing pre-dawn air to tend to the herd before she could even stir. By the time he returned, the house would be warm, the scent of baking biscuits and frying bacon masking the lingering smell of fresh-cut pine. They spoke only in necessities. "The flour is running low. A coyote got near the chicken coop last night. I mended that tear in your canvas coat." Yet the silence between them was no longer the deafening, hostile void of their carriage ride. It was a watchful, pulsing thing. Elias found himself pausing in his work just to observe her from a distance. One blistering Tuesday afternoon, he sat atop his gelding on a ridge overlooking the homestead. Below, Joe was in the small patch of turned earth she had stubbornly claimed as a garden. She wore one of his old, oversized linen shirts over her faded dress to protect her skin from the vicious sun. The sleeves rolled up past her elbows. She was wrestling with a stubborn tangle of prairie grass roots, her face smudged with dirt, a stray lock of hair plastered to her sweaty forehead. Clementine would have perished. Clementine would have demanded a hired hand. Joe simply wiped her brow with the back of a soil-stained hand, gripped the heavy iron hoe, and struck the earth again with a grunt of pure, unadulterated grit. She was competent. She was fierce. And God help him, she was exactly the woman he had fallen in love with on paper. The realization irritated Elias. He wanted to remain angry. He needed the armor of his betrayal to keep her at a safe distance, because if he let that armor slip, he knew he would be entirely at her mercy. The breaking point arrived on a violently windy Thursday. Elias was in the corral, trying to break a raw-boned, stubborn roan Mustang he had acquired in a trade. The horse was half wild, eyes rolling white with panic. Elias had him cornered, speaking in low, soothing tones, reaching out with a rope. But a sudden gust of wind slammed the barn door shut with the crack of a cannon shot. The roan spooked. It reared up, 1,000 pounds of panicked muscle and iron-shod hooves. Elias tried to pivot, but his boot caught in the deep mud. The horse's shoulders slammed into Elias's chest, tossing him backward like a rag doll. He hit the heavy timber fencing of the corral, his right shoulder taking the full, sickening brunt of the impact. The wood cracked. Elias crumpled to the mud, the wind knocked out of him in a violent rush. He lay there for a long moment, tasting copper and dirt, waiting for the black spots in his vision to clear. His shoulder throbbed with a blinding white-hot agony that radiated down to his fingertips. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself up. The horse had retreated to the far corner, trembling. Elias swore, clutching his right arm tight against his ribs, and began the long, agonizing walk back to the house. He didn't want Joe to see him like this. He was the protector, the provider. He wasn't supposed to be broken. He managed to push the kitchen door open with his left hand, leaning heavily against the door frame, his face ashen, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hisses. Joe was at the sink, washing potatoes beneath the golden light of the west-facing window. She turned at the sound of his heavy, uneven footsteps. The potatoes slipped from her hands, splashing into the basin. "Elias!" She was across the room in a second, her hands hovering over him, her dark eyes wide with sudden, sharp terror. "What happened? You're bleeding. Your head—" He hadn't even realized his head was bleeding until she pointed it out. A shallow scrape near his temple was dripping a steady line of crimson down his jaw. "The roan," he ground out, squeezing his eyes shut against a fresh wave of nausea. "Pinned me against the fence. It's just my shoulder. Might be dislocated." "Sit down. Right now," she ordered. Gone was the quiet, submissive woman of the past month. In her place was a commander, her voice ringing with absolute authority. Elias was in too much pain to argue. He sank into the heavy oak chair at the kitchen table, groaning as the movement jostled his arm. Joe didn't panic. She moved with a frightening efficiency. Within moments, she had a basin of hot water, clean rags, and a bottle of strong whiskey on the table. "Take off the shirt," she instructed, her voice tight but remarkably steady. Elias hesitated. "Joe, it's fine, I can—" "Elias Vance, if you do not take off that shirt, I will cut it off you with the butchering knife," she threatened, and the fierce glint in her eyes told him she meant every word. Using his good arm, he clumsily unbuttoned his work shirt, wincing as he peeled the sweat-soaked fabric down his injured shoulder. It was an ugly sight. The skin was already turning a deep, angry purple, swelling rapidly around the joint. But that wasn't what made Joe suck in a sharp breath. As the shirt fell away, her eyes raked over his chest and back. Elias's body was a roadmap of violence and survival. There were the jagged white lines of a cougar attack from his trapping days in the north, the smooth, round puckers of a gunshot wound on his left flank, and the crisscrossing scars on his back from a childhood he never spoke of. He felt a sudden, burning shame. He braced himself for her pity, or worse, her disgust. He looked away, staring hard at the grain of the wooden table. Joe didn't say a word. She poured a generous splash of whiskey over a clean rag. "This is going to sting," she murmured. Her touch was incredibly gentle. She cleaned the scrape on his head, her fingers lightly brushing his hair. Then she moved to his shoulder. She didn't flinch at his scars. Instead, she laid her warm, ink-stained palm flat against his uninjured collarbone to steady him as she probed the swollen joint with her other hand. "It's not dislocated," she said softly, her breath ghosting across his skin, sending an involuntary shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "But the muscle is badly torn. You're going to have a spectacular bruise." "I've had worse," he muttered, his voice dropping an octave, intensely aware of her proximity. He could smell the lye soap on her skin, mixed with the earthy scent of the garden. "I know," Joe replied, her eyes tracing a long, faded scar across his chest. She paused, her fingertips resting lightly against his skin, her thumb brushing right over his heartbeat, which was suddenly hammering against his ribs. "In your letters," she whispered, the silence in the kitchen heavy and thick. "You once wrote that scars are just the body's way of keeping a diary of the lessons we've learned the hard way. You said you hoped to find someone who wouldn't mind reading the pages." Elias froze. He turned his head slowly. Their faces were inches apart. He looked into her deep, dark eyes and saw no pity, no fear, only a profound, aching understanding. "I remember writing that," he said roughly, the last remnants of his anger dissolving into dust under her gaze. "To a woman I thought didn't exist." "She exists, Elias," Joe breathed, her hand still resting over his heart. "She just didn't look the way you expected." For a heartbeat, the world stopped turning. Elias looked at her mouth, a sudden fierce hunger roaring to life in his chest. He wanted to close the distance. He wanted to pull her into his lap, injured shoulder be damned, and kiss her until the ghosts of her sister and his pride were entirely eradicated. He leaned in, the air between them turning electric. Joe's eyes fluttered shut, her breath hitching, leaning slightly toward him. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, a shrill, piercing shriek that shattered the moment like a hammer on glass. They both jumped back, Joe's face flooded with crimson, her hands quickly retreating to her apron as she practically ran to the stove to pull the kettle off the heat. Elias cleared his throat, suddenly feeling very naked and entirely unbalanced. I'll bind your shoulder," Joe stuttered, keeping her back to him as she tore a strip of clean linen. As she wrapped his shoulder in taut, agonizing silence, Elias knew one thing with absolute certainty. The marriage of convenience was a lie. The wall he had built between them was gone. And keeping his hands off his wife was going to be the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. The invitation arrived pinned to a sack of flour from the general store in Dust Creek. It was an ornate piece of parchment announcing the annual autumn harvest barn dance at the sprawling Bar K Ranch 10 miles down the valley. Under normal circumstances, Elias would have tossed it into the hearth. He had no patience for forced joviality, weak cider, and the gossipy wives of neighboring ranchers. But these were not normal circumstances. Mr. Abernathy, the meticulous district land agent who held the fate of Elias's homestead claim in his bureaucratic hands, would be attending. "We have to go," Elias announced that evening over a supper of venison stew. "Abernathy needs to see a happily married couple deeply in love and settling the land. If we hide out here, rumors will start. The Bar K owner, Harrison, is just waiting for an excuse to challenge my boundary lines." Joe paused with her spoon halfway to her mouth, a flicker of panic in her eyes. "A dance? Elias, I don't have anything to wear to a gathering like that. Everyone will be in their Sunday best. My blue dress is practically threadbare from the travel." Elias looked at her across the table. In the warm glow of the oil lamp, he saw the deep-seated insecurity that years of living in Clementine's shadow had carved into her. To the rest of the world, Joe was the spinster sister, the plain workhorse. He hated the thought of her feeling inferior to the local women. "You'll wear whatever you want," Elias said firmly, "but you won't wear threadbare." The next morning, before Joe woke, Elias rode into town. He didn't just buy supplies. He walked into Mrs. Gable's mercantile and slapped a gold coin on the glass counter. He demanded the finest bolt of fabric in the store, a rich, deep sapphire blue velvet that reminded him of the twilight sky over the Rockies. He bought lace, matching silk ribbons, and a delicate silver hairpin shaped like a swallow. When he presented the wrapped bundle to Joe upon his return, she wept. She spent the next 3 nights sitting by the fire, her needle flying with desperate, joyful speed, transforming the raw fabric into a gown. The night of the dance, a crisp autumn chill hung in the air. Elias hitched the bays to the carriage, wearing his dark suit, his right arm still slightly stiff but healing. He waited by the porch, tapping his boot impatiently. The heavy front door opened. Elias turned around, the reprimand about being late dying instantly on his lips. Joe stepped onto the porch. The sapphire velvet clung perfectly to the curves he hadn't let himself notice, sweeping down to graze the tops of her polished boots. The dark lace at her collar accented the long, elegant line of her neck. Her hair, normally bound in a severe bun, was swept up in soft waves, held in place by the silver swallow pin, with a few dark curls escaping to frame her face. She wasn't flashy or ostentatious like Clementine. She was breathtaking. She looked like a queen of the prairie. Will this do? Joe asked nervously, her hands smoothing the skirts. Elias swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He stepped forward, offering his arm. It'll do, he managed to say, his voice gruff to mask the absolute awe rattling in his chest. You look beautiful, Joe. Truly. A soft, genuine smile blossomed on her face, illuminating her features in a way that made Elias's heart hammer painfully against his ribs. She slipped her hand into the crook of his arm, and they rode toward the Bar K. The barn was immense, the massive double doors thrown wide open to spill golden light out onto the frost-kissed grass. Dozens of lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over a sea of swirling skirts and dark suits. A band, 3 fiddles, a banjo, and an upright bass, was playing a lively reel in the corner. The air smelled of roasted beef, sweet apple cider, and expensive perfumes mingling with the scent of hay. The moment they walked in, heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Elias felt Joe stiffen beside him, her grip on his arm tightening. Steady, he murmured, placing his free hand over hers, his thumb stroking her knuckles. Let them look. They were immediately intercepted by Mr. Abernathy, a thin man with spectacles and a ledger practically fused to his arm. Ah, Mr. Vance. And this must be the new Mrs. Vance, Abernathy said, his eyes darting between them, searching for any cracks in the facade. I must say, Elias, you kept her hidden away. We all expected the golden-haired Miss Clementine based on your earlier descriptions. Joe flinched, but before she could speak, Elias pulled her closer, wrapping a protective arm around her waist. Plans change, Abernathy, Elias said smoothly, looking down at Joe with an expression so fiercely tender it made her breath catch. A man can be blinded by a pretty picture, but he settles down with the woman who holds his soul. I realized I was writing to Josephine all along. I'm the luckiest man in Colorado. Abernathy blinked, clearly taken aback by the sheer sincerity in the rugged rancher's voice. Well, splendid, splendid. I'll have your final patent papers filed by Monday. As the land agent waddled away, Joe looked up at Elias, her eyes wide. That was a very convincing performance, Mr. Vance. Who said I was performing? Elias countered softly. Before she could process the weight of his words, the lively reel ended, and the band struck up the slow, sweeping chords of a waltz. Dance with me, Elias commanded gently. He didn't wait for an answer. He led her onto the cleared wooden floor, placing one large hand firmly on her waist and taking her other hand in his. As they began to move, the rest of the barn simply vanished. There was no Abernathy, no gossiping neighbors, no ghost of Clementine. There was only the heat of Elias's hand scorching through the velvet at her waist and the overwhelming proximity of his massive frame. He didn't hold her at the respectable stiff distance required by polite society. He pulled her flush against his chest. Joe could feel the solid wall of his muscles, the steady, thundering beat of his heart against her own. She looked up, and his ice-blue eyes were locked onto hers with an intensity that made her dizzy. They moved together flawlessly, a silent conversation of shifting weight and subtle pressure. Every point where their bodies touched felt like it was on fire. Elias breathed in the scent of lye and lavender, his gaze dropping to the soft parted line of her lips. The air between them grew impossibly thick, charged with the unsaid desires that had been building since the afternoon in the kitchen. The waltz ended, but Elias didn't let her go. He stood there in the middle of the floor, his chest heaving, his hand still gripping her waist as if letting go would kill him. It's too loud in here, he rasped, his voice rough. He took her hand and led her out of the side doors of the barn, away from the light and the music, into the cool, silent darkness of the autumn night. They stopped under the sprawling branches of a massive oak tree, the moonlight filtering through the dying leaves to paint silver patterns on the ground. Elias turned her to face him, backing her gently against the rough bark of the tree. He bracketed her with his arms, his massive frame shielding her from the wind and the world. Elias, Joe whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his face in the darkness. I lied to you, Elias said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her skin. He reached up, his calloused thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, mapping her features as if he were memorizing them. The day I brought you to the ranch, I told you I wouldn't touch you. I told you it was just a bargain. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her cheek. Joe's hands instinctively came up to rest against his chest, clutching the lapels of his suit jacket. She could feel his heart hammering wildly beneath her fingers. I can't keep that bargain, Joe, he confessed, the agonizing vulnerability in his voice laying him completely bare. I don't want a housekeeper. I don't want a name on a piece of paper. I want the woman who wrote those letters. I want the woman who planted a garden in the dirt and bound my shoulder without flinching. He lowered his head, his face mere inches from hers. I want my wife. Joe let out a ragged breath, a tear slipping down her cheek, glittering like a diamond in the moonlight. You have her, she whispered, her hands sliding up his chest to wrap around the thick corded muscles of his neck. You've always had her. Elias groaned, a sound of pure surrender, and crushed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a gentle, polite kiss. It was 2 years of pent-up longing, of words written in the dark, of anger and betrayal, and an overwhelming, all-consuming realization of love. It was fire and whiskey and the wild Colorado wind. He kissed her until she forgot her name, until her knees went weak and she had to cling to him to stay upright. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her completely against him, sealing the cracks in his soul with her warmth. When they finally broke apart, both of them gasping for air, Elias rested his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes, a profound peace settling over him for the first time in his life. The foundation of his house was built of pine and stone, but standing under the moonlight, holding Josephine in his arms, Elias knew he had finally found his home. The carriage ride back to the Vance ranch was a world away from the agonizing silence of their journey from Dust Creek a month prior. Tonight, the Colorado sky was choked with thick, bruised clouds, swallowing the moon and promising a violent autumn storm. But inside the carriage, a different kind of electricity crackled. Elias drove the bays with one hand. His other arm was wrapped tightly around Josephine, pulling her flush against his side beneath a heavy wool blanket. She rested her head against his good shoulder, the scent of his bay rum and the crisp night air filling her senses. Neither of them spoke. Words felt too fragile, too inadequate to encompass the seismic shift that had occurred under the oak tree at the Barquet. When they finally pulled into the dooryard, the first fat drops of freezing rain began to fall, striking the brim of Elias's hat like buckshot. Get inside, Elias urged, his voice a low, rough murmur as he helped her down from the wagon. I'll stable the horses and be right in. Joe gathered her sapphire velvet skirts and hurried up the porch steps, her heart hammering a frantic, joyful rhythm against her ribs. She pushed open the heavy oak door. The house was cold and steeped in shadows, but it no longer felt like a monument to a ghost. It felt like theirs. She quickly set to work, lighting the oil lamps and kneeling before the massive stone hearth to coax the banked embers back to life. By the time Elias stepped through the door, shaking the rain from his broad shoulders and tossing his hat onto a peg, a cheerful fire was roaring, casting dancing orange light across the pine floorboards. Elias locked the heavy deadbolt with a resounding clack, shutting out the rising howl of the wind. He turned to face her. Joe stood up, suddenly breathless. The vast expanse of the main room seemed to shrink as he walked slowly toward her. The fierce, unyielding rancher who commanded horses and men with a single look was staring at her with a hunger so profound it made her tremble. He stopped mere inches away. Without a word, he reached up, his rough, scarred fingers tangling gently in her dark hair. He found the silver swallow hairpin he had bought her and carefully pulled it free. Her hair tumbled down over her shoulders in a cascade of dark waves. I've wanted to do that all night, Elias whispered, his voice dropping to a gravelly register that sent a shiver straight down her spine. Elias, she breathed, leaning into his touch as his thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. No more bargains, Joe, he vowed, his eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive light. He cupped her face in both hands, tilting her head up. You are my wife, before God, before the law, and before my own heart. I want you to share my room, my bed, my life. He didn't wait for her to answer. He brought his mouth down on hers, and the world outside simply ceased to exist. It was a kiss of absolute claiming, searing, and desperate. Joe's arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers gripping the lapels of his suit jacket. The heat radiating from his massive body was intoxicating. Elias groaned, sliding his hands down to her waist, lifting her slightly off her feet, his mouth devouring hers with a passion that had been starved for 2 long years. They were so lost in each other that the first sound barely registered over the roar of the fire and the pounding of their own blood. Thump, thump, thump. It was a weak, frantic sound, barely audible over the screaming wind outside. Elias froze, breaking the kiss, his chest heaving against hers. His head snapped toward the front door, his eyes instantly narrowing, the romantic haze vanishing, replaced by the lethal instincts of a frontiersman. Stay behind me, he ordered softly, setting Joe on her feet and moving her gently behind his broad back. He reached toward the mantel, his hand closing over the cold iron handle of the Winchester rifle he kept loaded there. Thump, thump, thump! Please, open the door! Help me! The voice was muffled, shrill, and painfully familiar. Joe felt the blood drain from her face. A cold, suffocating dread pooled in her stomach, turning the warmth of the fire into ice. She looked at Elias and saw the exact moment the realization hit him. His jaw clenched so tight the muscle leaped under his skin. He marched to the door, the rifle held at the ready, and threw the deadbolt back. The wind ripped the heavy door from his grasp, slamming it against the inside wall with a deafening crash. Standing on the porch, illuminated by the flashes of lightning and the golden spill of the parlor light, was a specter from the past, Clementine Sterling. She was a vision of absolute ruin. The golden hair that had once been her crowning glory was matted with mud and rain, plastered flat against her skull. Her expensive traveling suit, likely bought with Elias's stolen money, was torn at the seams, soaked through and caked in prairie dirt. Her face was bruised, a nasty purple welt swelling over her left eye, and her lips were cracked and bleeding. She stood trembling violently in the freezing rain, her arms wrapped around her thin frame. She looked past the barrel of Elias's rifle, her wide, terrified blue eyes finding him. "Elias?" Clementine sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, shattered wail. "Oh, thank God! Elias, please. He left me. He took everything and left me to die in the dirt." Elias stood motionless, a towering wall of absolute stone. He didn't lower the rifle, he didn't step aside. The fury radiating from him was a palpable, terrifying force. "You have a lot of nerve coming to this house," Elias said, his voice softer than the wind, yet carrying a deadly, serrated edge that cut straight to the bone. "Get off my porch." Clementine gasped, taking a stumbling step forward, reaching out a shaking, mud-stained hand toward his chest. "No, please! You can't turn me away. You promised to protect me. You swore it in your letters. You built this house for me." "I built it for my wife," Elias snarled, stepping back as if her touch were venomous. "And she is standing right behind me. You stole my money, you made a fool of me, and you abandoned your family. Ride back to whatever ditch Silas Thorne left you in. You are not crossing my threshold." He moved to slam the door in her face. "Elias, wait!" Joe cried out, stepping out from behind him. She couldn't help it. Years of ingrained conditioning, of being the older sister, the caretaker, the one who cleaned up Clementine's messes, overrode her common sense. Seeing her sister bruised and freezing triggered a frantic maternal panic. "Joe, don't," Elias warned, his arm shooting out to block her. "She'll freeze to death, Elias," Joe pleaded, her heart tearing in 2 different directions. She hated the girl standing on the porch. but she couldn't watch her die. Just for tonight. We can send her to town tomorrow. Clementine seized the opening. She collapsed onto her knees on the wet porch boards, sobbing hysterically. Joe, please forgive me. I was so foolish. He hit me, Joe. Silas hit me and threw me from the wagon. I walked for 2 days. I'm so cold. Elias looked at Joe's pleading eyes, cursing violently under his breath. He lowered the rifle. One night, he growled, grabbing Clementine roughly by the arm and hauling her inside, dripping muddy water onto the pristine pine floors he had laid by hand. Tomorrow at first light you are gone. Clementine collapsed in a shivering heap near the hearth, coughing weakly. Joe immediately went to work, fetching blankets and hot water, the magical evening entirely shattered. An hour later, Clementine was wrapped in dry wool, sitting in Elias's heavy armchair by the fire, drinking a cup of hot broth. The bruised, pathetic victim act had settled, and as she looked around the expansive, beautifully crafted room, a different, sharper light entered her blue eyes. Elias stood on the opposite side of the room, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of barely contained violence. Tell me where you hid the money, Clementine. The 300 I sent you in Hiram's lockbox. Clementine took a slow sip of her broth, her gaze drifting over Joe, who was standing quietly near the kitchen doorway in her beautiful sapphire dress. A flash of pure, venomous jealousy contorted Clementine's bruised face before she quickly masked it. Silas took the money, Clementine said, her voice trembling, though the fear seemed less genuine now. He took it all to a high-stakes poker game in Denver, but he didn't take everything. Speak plain, or I'll throw you back into the storm, Elias demanded. Clementine reached into the bodice of her borrowed dry dress and pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment, sealed with the official red wax of the Colorado Land Office. Hiram didn't just owe Mayor Higgins, Clementine said, a sly, desperate smile touching her cracked lips. He was in deep to a railroad tycoon from Chicago, a man named Vance. No, wait. A man named Vanderbilt's associate. Hiram was desperate. He sold the water rights. Elias pushed off the wall, his face going terrifyingly pale. What? The 50 acres bordering your property, Clementine said, holding the paper up. The stretch that holds the bend of Dust Creek. The only year-round water source for your cattle. Hiram owned it. He sold it to the syndicate a week before I left. Silas stole the deed from Hiram's lockbox to sell it back to them for a premium. Elias crossed the room in 2 massive strides, snatching the paper from her hand. He ripped it open, his eyes flying over the legal jargon. It was true. A fully executed deed of transfer. If a syndicate dammed or diverted that water, Elias's entire herd would die of thirst by midsummer. His ranch would be worthless dust. Silas got drunk and passed out before he could deliver it, Clementine whispered, staring up at Elias with a terrifying mix of triumph and desperation. I took it from his coat pocket before he threw me out. It hasn't been filed with the county clerk yet. It's the only original copy. Elias stared at the paper, his knuckles turning white. He held the very lifeblood of his dream in his hands. He could throw it in the fire right now, and the sale would never exist. If you burn it, Clementine said, reading his mind with alarming accuracy, the syndicate has a bill of sale signed by Hiram. They will drag you into federal court for destroying legal documents. You'll lose the ranch to legal fees before the year is out. The only way to save your land, Elias, is for Hiram to legally transfer it to you before the syndicate can file their claim. Hiram won't do that, Joe spoke up, her voice shaking. He hates us. He will if I tell him to, Clementine said smoothly, leaning back in the chair. He still needs me to marry Higgins to clear his local debts. He'll do whatever I say if I promise to come home and be a good, obedient daughter. She looked at Elias, the bruised, battered girl transforming back into the manipulative, golden-haired siren who had played with his heart for 2 years. You need me, Elias, Clementine purred softly, the words slicing through the room like a razor blade. You need me to save your dream home. And I need a place to stay until I am healed and ready to negotiate with my stepfather. It looks like you won't be throwing me out tomorrow after all." Joe watched the exchange from the shadows of the kitchen doorway, feeling the floorboards of the house she had just begun to believe was hers, crack and splinter beneath her feet. The Vance homestead, once a sanctuary of quiet routines and blooming affection, transformed into a suffocating pressure cooker overnight. The storm outside eventually broke, giving way to the stark, blinding sunlight of a Colorado autumn. But inside the heavy log walls, a dark, heavy tempest raged continuously. True to her word, Clementine did not leave. She entrenched herself in the parlor, claiming the space by the hearth as her personal convalescent ward. The bruises on her face faded with agonizing slowness into a sickly yellow, a constant visual reminder of her suffering that she weaponized daily. For Joe, it was a nightmare resurrected. She was thrust violently back into the role she had played her entire life, the invisible utilitarian shadow to her sister's blinding light. Clementine refused to lift a finger. She complained that the venison was too tough, the coffee too bitter, and the drafts in the house unbearable. She demanded hot water for baths, and when Joe, out of a deeply ingrained sense of duty and guilt, provided it, Clementine offered nothing but a dismissive wave of her hand. But the physical labor was nothing compared to the psychological warfare Clementine waged. She was a master of the subtle barb, the backhanded compliment delivered with a sweet, sympathetic smile. She wore Joe's clothes, the few decent dresses Joe possessed, stretching the fabric across her fuller figure, making a point to parade around the kitchen. "It's so incredibly noble of you, Elias, to have taken pity on my poor sister," Clementine sighed loudly one evening. She was sitting in his armchair, a blanket draped over her lap, watching Elias clean his rifle at the dining table. Joe was at the sink, her hands plunged into scalding, soapy water, scrubbing the supper dishes. Elias didn't look up from his gunmetal. His jaw was set so hard it looked carved from granite. "I didn't take pity on anyone. I married my equal." Clementine let out a soft, melodic laugh that grated against Joe's nerves like sandpaper. "Oh, you don't have to pretend, Elias. We all know Joe was destined to be a spinster. It's perfectly fine. She's so sturdy, so good at chores. Not everyone is made for romance. Some are just made for utility." Joe's hands stopped moving in the water. She stared blindly out the west-facing window, the golden sunset suddenly looking bleak and mocking. Sturdy, utility. The words echoed her deepest, darkest insecurities. Elias slammed the rag down on the table, the sharp crack making both women jump. He stood up, towering over the room, his eyes blazing with a suppressed fury. He opened his mouth to unleash hell on Clementine, but she immediately shrank back into the chair, clutching her chest, a perfect picture of a terrified, battered woman. Elias stopped. He looked at the bruised cheek. He looked at the spot where she kept the folded deed tucked away. His hands curled into massive fists at his sides. He needed that deed. He needed Hiram's signature. If he threw her out, she would go straight to the syndicate, and his cattle would die. He swallowed his rage, a visible, agonizing effort, grabbed his hat and stormed out the front door, slamming it behind him so hard the windows rattled. Joe squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear slipping down her cheek and mingling with the dishwater. She didn't see Elias's restraint as a sacrifice for the ranch. She saw it as hesitation. She saw a man who couldn't bring himself to be cruel to the beautiful woman he had originally chosen, even after everything she had done. The distance between Joe and Elias, which had vanished so beautifully on the night of the dance, returned with a vengeance. It wasn't a cold distance, but a desperate, agonizing one. Elias was constantly on edge, driven mad by the presence of the woman he despised, and his inability to touch the woman he loved. He spent every waking hour pushing the herd, mending fences that didn't need mending, staying out of the house until long after dark. When he did come inside, Clementine was always there, a clinging, toxic vine. She would manufacture reasons to touch him, brushing lint from his sleeve, laying a hand on his arm to ask him a question, her voice dropping to a low, intimate purr. "Do you remember, Elias, when you wrote about the wild mustangs?" Clementine murmured one afternoon, trapping him in the narrow hallway leading to the kitchen. Joe was kneading dough at the table, forced to listen. "You said you wanted to tame one just for me. You said you'd call him Golden after my hair." Joe's heart physically ached. It was a lie. Elias had never written that. Joe had written asking about the mustangs, and Elias had replied detailing the brutal practical process of breaking them. But Elias couldn't call Clementine out on the lie without revealing to her the depth of his intimate correspondence with Joe, something he fiercely protected. Instead, Elias stepped back, his face a mask of revulsion. "Get out of my way, Clementine." But as he moved past her, Clementine stumbled, grasping his shirt to steady herself, her face inches from his chest. At that exact moment, Joe turned around, her hands covered in flour. She saw her husband, the man who had kissed her with such devastating passion, standing practically chest to chest with the blonde beauty who was supposed to be his bride. Elias immediately shoved Clementine away, panic flashing in his blue eyes as he looked at Joe. "Joe, it's not—" "I need to fetch more firewood," Joe interrupted, her voice entirely dead. She didn't look at him. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked past them both, out into the biting autumn wind. That night, lying awake on the narrow cot she had retreated to in the parlor corner, refusing to share the loft with Elias while her sister occupied the room, Joe made a decision that broke her own heart. She stared up at the heavy pine beams of the ceiling. Elias had built this house with his own blood and sweat. It was his sanctuary, his dream, and now, because of her, it was a battleground. He was trapped. He was tied to a plain, unremarkable woman he had married out of necessity, forced to endure the presence of his beautiful, treacherous ex-fiancée just to save his land. He built this house for her face, and my words, Joe thought, a silent sob racking her chest. But he can't have both, and he is too honorable a man to ever ask me to leave. He will suffer in silence, lose his mind, and maybe even lose his ranch, all because he swore an oath to me. True love, Joe realized with a crushing, suffocating despair, wasn't about holding on. It was about knowing when to let go. Elias needed the water rights. He needed Clementine to get them. Joe was just the obstacle standing in the way of his survival. The clock on the mantel chimed 2 a.m. Joe quietly slipped out from under the blankets. She didn't light a lamp. Moving like a ghost through the home she had desperately wanted to call her own, she pulled her battered leather trunk from under the cot. She packed exactly what she had brought, nothing more. She folded her threadbare gingham dresses, her sturdy boots, and the few books she owned. When she reached the sapphire velvet dress Elias had bought her, she stopped. She ran her ink-stained fingers over the rich, soft fabric, a ragged gasp escaping her lips. She couldn't take it. It didn't belong to the spinster from the post office. It belonged to the queen of the prairie, a woman who only existed for one magical night under the moonlight. She folded the dress meticulously and laid it on the kitchen table, placing the silver swallow hairpin on top of it. Finally, she walked to the sink. She looked out the west-facing window one last time. It was pitch black outside, offering no reflection, only an endless, terrifying void. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room, to the river-stone hearth, and to the man sleeping in the loft above. "I'm giving you back your dream, Elias." She hoisted the heavy trunk by its leather strap, the strain biting into her shoulder, and walked silently out the front door, stepping off the wide cedar porch and vanishing into the unforgiving, ink-black Colorado night. The cold on the Colorado plains at 3 in the morning possessed a sharp, biting edge that could slice right through a man's bones. But it was nothing compared to the ice that flooded Elias Vance's veins when he stepped down from the loft and found the parlor empty. The narrow cot in the corner was made with military precision. The heavy wool blankets were folded tightly. Josephine's battered leather trunk, which had sat at the foot of the bed since the day she arrived, was gone. Elias stood frozen in the center of the room, his heart suddenly hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. "Joe," he called out, his voice sounding hollow in the vast, silent house. He strode into the kitchen, striking a match with trembling fingers to light the oil lamp. The soft yellow glow illuminated the heavy oak table. Sitting perfectly in the center, folded with agonizing care, was the sapphire blue velvet dress. Resting on top of the rich fabric was the silver swallow hairpin. No note, no tear-stained goodbye, just a quiet, absolute surrender. Elias didn't need a letter to understand what had happened. He knew how her mind worked. He knew the deep-seated corrosive belief she harbored that she was meant to be the sacrifice, the stepping stone for her sister's success. She had looked at his desperate need for the water rights, looked at Clementine's venomous blackmail, and calculated that the only way to save his dream was to remove herself from the equation. "You foolish, beautiful idiot," Elias breathed, his voice cracking. The anger that erupted in him wasn't directed at her. It was a white-hot, explosive fury aimed entirely at himself. He had let his pride and his fear of vulnerability make her feel like an obligation. He had let Clementine poison their home. Elias didn't bother grabbing his coat. He sprinted out the back door, the freezing wind tearing at his linen shirt, and threw open the barn doors. He didn't waste time with a saddle. He threw a bridle over the massive head of his fastest gelding, a raw-boned black horse named Midnight, vaulted onto the animal's bare back, and kicked him into a dead run. The moon offered only a thin silver sliver of light, but Elias knew this land like the back of his own scarred hand. He pushed the horse mercilessly down the wagon trail leading toward Dust Creek, his eyes scanning the endless sea of silver-tipped sagebrush. He found her 3 miles from the property line. She was a small, dark figure struggling against the wind, dragging the heavy leather trunk by its strap. Every few steps she had to stop, her shoulders heaving with exhaustion, before gripping the leather again with sheer, stubborn grit. "Joe!" Elias roared, the sound tearing from his throat like a physical thing. Joe dropped the trunk, whirling around. In the dim light, Elias could see her face was pale, her dark eyes wide with shock and a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. Elias hauled back on the reins, bringing the black horse to a sliding, dust-kicking halt directly in her path. He threw himself off the horse before it had even fully stopped moving, closing the distance between them in 3 massive strides. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his chest heaving, his hands hovering over her arms, desperately wanting to grab her but terrified she would shatter. "I'm giving it back to you, Elias," Joe said, her voice trembling but her chin held high in that familiar defensive posture. "The house, the ranch. I heard Clementine. I know about the water rights. If I stay, she'll destroy you. If I leave, she'll give you the deed." "And you thought I would accept that?" Elias stepped closer, towering over her, his blue eyes blazing with a fierce, terrifying intensity. "You thought I would trade my wife for a damn creek?" "It's not just a creek," Joe cried, tears finally spilling over her lashes, carving clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "It's your life's work. It's the dream you bled for. You built that house for her, Elias. You built it for the girl with the golden hair, and I am just the ink-stained spinster who tricked you into letting her inside." "Stop it!" Elias's hands clamped down on her shoulders, gripping her tightly. He gave her a slight shake, forcing her to look up and meet his eyes. "Listen to me, Josephine Vance, and you listen to me well. I didn't build that house for a face. I built it for a soul." Joe stopped struggling, her breath catching in her throat. "I built it," Elias continued, his voice dropping to a rough, gravelly whisper that vibrated with absolute truth. "For the woman who knew I needed riverstones for the hearth, because I wanted something permanent. I built it for the woman who understood why the west-facing window mattered. I fell in love with a mind, Joe. I fell in love with a heart. And I found out it belonged to the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known." He slid his hands up her neck, cupping her cold face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "The house is just wood and nails. The land is just dirt. Without you, none of it means a damn thing. I'd strike a match and burn it all to the ground myself before I let you walk away from me. Jo stared at him, the walls she had built around her heart for 24 years finally completely crumbling. She let out a ragged sob and buried her face in his chest. Elias wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her dark hair, holding her so tightly he could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his own. "We are going home," Elias murmured against her temple, "and we are cleaning house." By the time the sun began to bleed over the jagged peaks of the Rockies, painting the sky in violent shades of crimson and gold, Elias and Jo rode back into the dooryard. They walked into the house together, Elias's hand firmly holding hers. Clementine was sitting at the heavy oak dining table sipping a cup of tea. She wore one of Jo's best day dresses, a smug, victorious smile playing on her lips. She had clearly noticed Jo's absence and assumed she had won the war. The smile vanished the second Elias walked through the door, his fingers interlaced with her sister's. "Elias?" Clementine faltered, setting the teacup down with a sharp clatter. "What is she doing back here?" Elias didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply let go of Jo's hand, walked over to the armchair where Clementine had left her ruined traveling bag, picked it up, and threw it out the open front door. It landed in the dirt with a heavy thud. "You have exactly 5 minutes to get off my property," Elias said, his voice as cold and hard as a glacier. "Start walking toward town. If you're lucky, a passing wagon will pick you up." Clementine sprang to her feet, her face turning an ugly mottled red. "You can't do this! The water rights!" "I have the deed, Elias. I'll take it straight to the syndicate. I'll make sure your cattle die of thirst and you lose every single thing you've built." "Take it," Elias challenged, stepping toward her, his sheer size and the lethal calm in his eyes forcing her to back up until she hit the edge of the table. "Sell it. Burn it. I don't care. I will dig a well with my bare hands if I have to. But you will not spend another second breathing the same air as my wife." The mask finally slipped completely. The beautiful, fragile victim evaporated, leaving behind a creature of pure, venomous spite. Clementine glared at them both, her face contorted with a hatred so deep it was almost demonic. "You're fools!" she hissed, grabbing her shawl and storming toward the door. "Both of you. You deserve this miserable dirt patch. But mark my words, Elias Vance. You will regret choosing that plain, pathetic spinster over me. I will see this place reduced to ashes before I let you be happy." Elias slammed the heavy oak door behind her, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot, sealing the threat outside. He turned back to Jo, who was trembling slightly in the center of the room. He crossed the floor, pulled her into his arms, and finally, truly, kissed his wife. The threat hung in the air all day, a suffocating, invisible weight, but Elias refused to let it steal their victory. That evening, for the first time since they had taken their vows, there was no distance between them. Elias moved Jo's trunk into the sturdy ground-floor bedroom he had just finished partitioning off from the main hall, a room he had built specifically to be the master chamber. By midnight, the wind had picked up, howling down from the mountains and rattling the heavy glass of the windows. Elias lay awake in the dark, his arm wrapped securely around Jo, her head resting on his good shoulder. Her breathing was deep and even, completely exhausted from the emotional toll of the day. Despite the warmth of her body against his, Elias couldn't sleep. Every instinct that had kept him alive on the frontier was screaming at him. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. Clementine's parting words, reduced to ashes, echoed relentlessly in his mind. He carefully slipped out from under the heavy quilt, making sure not to wake Jo. He pulled on his trousers and his boots, grabbed the Winchester rifle from the corner of the room, and stepped out into the main parlor. The house was pitch black, smelling faintly of the dead embers in the hearth. He needed to check the perimeter. He needed to make sure the barn was secure. Elias stepped out the back door, immediately hit by a wall of freezing wind. He walked toward the stables, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The horses were restless, kicking at their stalls and snorting nervously. Elias spent 20 minutes soothing them, checking the locks and scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. Nothing but the wind. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He was being paranoid. Clementine was a manipulative coward. She wouldn't have the stomach to actually return in the dead of night. He turned around to head back to the house, and his heart stopped. A flicker of bright, unnatural orange danced against the heavy logs of the front porch. In the span of a single heartbeat, the flicker erupted into a roaring, ravenous wall of fire. Someone had drenched the dry cedar posts and the porch floorboards in kerosene. The wind caught the flames, whipping them into a frenzy, driving the fire straight up the front of the house and toward the dry pine shingles of the roof. "Joe!" Elias screamed, dropping the rifle in the dirt and breaking into a dead sprint. He rounded the side of the house just as the front windows shattered from the intense heat, blowing shards of glass out into the yard. The roar of the fire was deafening, a monstrous, crackling beast devouring everything in its path. He couldn't go through the front door. It was completely engulfed. He raced to the back kitchen door, throwing his entire weight against the heavy wood. He burst into the kitchen. The air inside was already thick with acrid black smoke, burning his eyes and searing his lungs. The fire had breached the front parlor and was eating its way rapidly toward the back of the house. The heat was unbearable, blistering his skin. "Joe!" he roared again, coughing violently. "Elias!" Her voice came from the ground-floor bedroom, muffled and panicked. Elias dropped to his hands and knees, crawling beneath the thickest layer of smoke, and scrambled down the short hallway. He grabbed the brass doorknob. It was scorching hot. He turned it and pushed. The door didn't budge. He shoved his shoulder against it with all his might. It held fast. "Elias, it won't open!" Jo cried from the other side, her voice accompanied by the frantic sound of her beating her fists against the wood. "Something is blocking it from the outside." Clementine. The realization hit him with sickening clarity. Before lighting the fire, Clementine had crept into the house and wedged a heavy wooden chair under the doorknob of the bedroom, effectively locking Jo inside a wooden cage. "Get back!" Elias yelled, his eyes watering so heavily he was almost blind. He didn't have time to find a tool. The ceiling above him was groaning, the heavy pine beam succumbing to the flames. He backed up as far as the narrow hallway would allow, lowered his good shoulder and threw his entire 220-pound frame against the thick oak door. Wood splintered, the frame groaned. He backed up and hit it again, and again. On the third strike, the door frame shattered inward, the heavy chair skidding across the bedroom floor. Elias stumbled into the room, gasping for air. Jo threw herself at him, her face smudged with soot, coughing uncontrollably. Elias wrapped his arms around her, burying her face in his chest. "I've got you," he rasped. "I've got you." Crack! The sound was like a cannon firing inside the house. Elias looked up just in time to see the main support beam above the hallway give way. A massive burning timber the size of a tree trunk plummeted toward them. Elias didn't think. He reacted. He shoved Jo violently toward the far wall, throwing his own body backward to cover her. The burning beam crashed down, missing Jo entirely, but the jagged, flaming end caught Elias squarely across his right shoulder, the same shoulder the Mustang had crushed weeks ago. The agonizing pain was instantaneous, blinding, and absolute. The heat seared through his shirt, the sheer weight of the timber pinning him to the floorboards. Elias let out a guttural roar of pure agony. "Elias!" Jo screamed, scrambling toward him. She grabbed the burning wood with her bare hands, ignoring the blistering heat, trying desperately to heave it off him. Driven by a primal surge of adrenaline and the absolute terror of losing the woman he loved, Elias planted his boots against the floor, gritted his teeth until he tasted blood, and heaved upward. Together, they managed to roll the heavy timber just enough for him to drag himself free. His shoulder was on fire, his right arm hanging uselessly at his side, but he couldn't stop. The room was entirely engulfed, the oxygen rapidly disappearing. "The window!" he shouted over the roar of the flames. He grabbed his heavy boots from the floor, threw them at the large glass window, shattering the pane. He used his good left arm to sweep the jagged shards from the frame, grabbed Jo around the waist, and practically threw her out into the cold night air before diving out after her. They hit the dirt yard hard, rolling away from the house just as the roof completely caved in, sending a massive plume of orange sparks shooting into the black sky. Elias pulled Joe into his lap, ignoring the excruciating pain radiating from his shoulder, wrapping his arms around her and rocking her back and forth as they both choked on the clean air. They sat in the dirt, bruised, bleeding, and covered in soot, and watched the house Elias had spent 2 years building, the dream home, the monument to their letters, burn to the ground. It was a total, catastrophic loss. Everything was gone. "I'm sorry," Joe sobbed, clinging to his ruined shirt, her tears cutting tracks through the black soot on his chest. "Elias, I am so sorry. It's all gone." Elias rested his chin on the top of her head. He looked at the raging inferno, the flames reflecting in his eyes. He thought he would feel devastation. He thought he would feel empty. But as he tightened his left arm around the trembling woman in his lap, he realized he didn't feel broken at all. "Let it burn," he whispered fiercely. "I have everything I need right here." As the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, illuminating the smoking, blackened skeleton of the house, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through the crackle of the dying fire. Elias instinctively pushed Joe behind him, reaching for his boot knife with his left hand, expecting Clementine or the syndicate men to finish the job. Instead, a posse of 6 men rode into the dooryard. At the front was Sheriff Brody from Dust Creek, his silver star gleaming in the dawn light. But it was the figure riding double behind one of the deputies that made Elias freeze. It was Clementine. Her hands were bound tightly in front of her with thick hemp rope. Her face was scratched and bleeding, her clothes covered in mud, and the venomous arrogance from the day before was entirely gone, replaced by absolute terror. Sheriff Brody dismounted, taking off his hat as he surveyed the smoking ruins of the house. He looked at Elias and Joe, his face grim. "Looks like we were about an hour too late, Vance," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with regret. "I am damn sorry about your home." Elias struggled to his feet, pulling Joe up beside him. "You caught her." "Found her 3 miles up the Denver road," Brody nodded, gesturing to Clementine, who refused to meet their eyes, weeping silently into her bound hands. "She was trying to ride out in the dark. Horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and threw her. She's got a broken ankle and a lot of explaining to do. We found an empty kerosene tin in her saddlebags." "She has a deed," Joe croaked out, her voice raspy from the smoke. "A deed to the water rights. She was going to sell it to the railroad syndicate." Sheriff Brody let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "That's why we were out riding in the first place, Mrs. Vance. Got a telegraph from the federal marshals in Denver last night. They busted a major gambling and forgery ring. Caught a fella named Silas Thorne. He confessed to a whole string of blackmail, including forging a bill of sale for some water rights down in Dust Creek to try and extort a syndicate buyer." Elias blinked, the words slowly penetrating the haze of pain and exhaustion. "Forged?" "The deed she's carrying is a fake, Elias," Brody confirmed. "Thorne drafted it himself. Hiram never sold the rights. Thorne just stole his seal from the lockbox. Hiram is a drunk, but he ain't stupid enough to cross the federal government. The land is yours, Vance. Always was." The sheriff tipped his hat. "We'll take her into town. The judge will want to see her for arson and attempted murder. You folks need a doctor. My deputy's riding to fetch Doc Evans now." As the posse turned their horses and rode away, taking the ghost of Clementine with them forever, Elias turned back to look at the smoking ruins of the foundation. He didn't have a house. He had a ruined shoulder, no clothes but the ones on his back, and winter was only a month away. But as he looked down at Josephine, his beautiful, fierce, brilliant wife, who was already ripping a strip of cloth from her petticoat to bind his bleeding shoulder, a slow, genuine smile spread across his soot-stained face. The house was gone, but the home was finally safe. 2 years later, the Colorado wind still howled down from the jagged peaks of the Rockies, but it no longer sounded like a threat. Today it sounded like a victory song, rustling through the leaves of the towering lilac bushes that flanked the wide, sweeping steps of the new Vance homestead. The house that sat upon the gentle rise overlooking the valley was not a replica of the one that had burned to ashes. It was something entirely new. It was bigger, the logs thicker, the joinery a testament to slow, deliberate patience rather than frantic anticipation. The river-stone chimney was twice as wide, anchoring the structure to the earth with an unshakable permanence. Elias and Joe hadn't hired a crew to rebuild it. They had spent the first brutal winter living in the insulated tack room of the barn, surviving on stored preserves and a fierce, newly forged bond. When the spring thaw came, they laid the new foundation together. Joe's hands had grown as calloused as his, her skin kissed golden by the sun, as she helped him heft the pine logs and mix the mortar. It wasn't a house built for a ghost in a letter. It was a fortress built by a husband and wife. Inside the massive sunlit kitchen, the scent of rising yeast and roasting venison filled the warm air. Jo stood at the deep porcelain sink, her hands buried in warm, soapy water. She wasn't wearing a threadbare gingham dress, but a sturdy, beautifully tailored skirt of deep indigo, a crisp white blouse rolled up to her elbows. The silver swallow hairpin caught the light as she moved. She paused in her work, wiping a stray curl from her forehead with the back of her wrist, and looked up. Before her was the west-facing window. Elias had framed it twice as large as the original. The late afternoon sun was just beginning its descent, pouring a river of liquid amber directly into the room, bathing the wooden floorboards in a halo of warmth. A heavy, familiar tread echoed on the porch, followed by the metallic clatter of spurs being kicked off by the door. Jo smiled, her heart giving that same involuntary flutter. It had the very first time he kissed her under the oak tree. The heavy oak door opened, and Elias stepped into the kitchen. He was covered in the dust of the trail, his canvas coat smelling of horses and fresh hay. He took off his Stetson, hanging it on a peg, and ran a hand through his dark hair. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched a little deeper by the harsh sun. But the heavy, burdened shadow that had once haunted him was entirely gone. In its place was an aura of profound, unshakable peace. His eyes found her immediately. They softened, the icy blue melting into something impossibly warm. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides. He didn't care about the dust on his clothes or the soap on her hands. He stepped behind her, wrapping his massive arms around her waist, pulling her back flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her skin, inhaling deeply. "I could smell the bread from the lower ridge," Elias murmured, his deep voice rumbling against her back. "If you hurried, it was only because you knew the butter was already churning," Jo teased gently, leaning her head back against his shoulder. She reached up, her wet hands carefully avoiding his shirt, to rest her wrists over his thick forearms. Beneath her right wrist, she could feel the thick, raised scar tissue beneath his sleeve, the permanent reminder of the burning timber that had nearly taken his life to save hers. He couldn't lift his right arm quite as high as he used to, but the arm that held her now was as strong as iron. "How is the herd?" she asked, turning her head slightly to look at him. "Fat and lazy," Elias chuckled softly. "The creek is running high. We'll have more than enough winter feed. Abernathy came by the property line this morning, took one look at the new fences and practically tipped his hat to the dirt." "Good," Jo said, a fierce light of pride in her dark eyes. The syndicate had tried to challenge their water rights one last time in federal court a year ago. Jo, armed with a stack of legal books she had ordered from Denver and her razor-sharp mind, had helped the town's lawyer build a defense so airtight the judge threw the syndicate's claim out before lunch. Elias turned her around in his arms, entirely ignoring the dishwater dripping onto his boots. He looked down at her, his expression turning serious, filled with that raw, overwhelming adoration that still took her breath away. "I was riding back up the rise," Elias said quietly, lifting a hand to cup her cheek, his thumb gently tracing her jawline. "And I looked at the house, at this window. I remembered the day you tried to walk away in the dark, dragging that blasted trunk, trying to give me back my dream." Joe's breath hitched. "I was a fool." "No," Elias corrected softly. "You were just used to carrying the weight of the world by yourself. I'm just glad I caught you before you got too far." He leaned down, capturing her lips in a slow, devastatingly tender kiss. It was a kiss that held no desperate bargains, no hidden ghosts, and no lingering fears. It was the kiss of a man entirely devoted to the woman who held his soul. A soft, demanding whimper broke the silence of the kitchen. They slowly pulled apart, both of them smiling. Elias didn't let go of her waist as he turned his head toward the corner of the room, near the warmth of the cast-iron stove. Resting on the floor was a cradle. It wasn't bought from a mercantile. Elias had carved it by hand during the long winter nights in the barn. He had salvaged the only unburned piece of oak from the original front door of the ruined house, stripping away the charred wood to reveal the strong, untouched heartwood beneath, and shaped it into a bed for their future. Inside, swaddled in soft white wool, a 6-month-old baby boy was waking from his nap. He had a shock of dark hair exactly like his mother's, but as he opened his eyes and looked up at them, they were the exact striking shade of Colorado ice blue. Elias stepped over to the cradle. He reached down with his massive, scarred hands that had broken Mustangs and built houses, and lifted the tiny boy with a gentleness that brought tears to Joe's eyes every single time she witnessed it. He settled the baby against his chest, supporting the small head with his palm. The boy immediately stopped fussing, grabbing a fistful of his father's canvas coat and cooing softly. Elias walked back to the sink, wrapping his free arm around Joe's shoulders, pulling her tightly against his side. Together, the three of them looked out the west-facing window. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, setting the sky ablaze in brilliant streaks of violet, crimson, and gold. It washed the new kitchen, the scarred rancher, the brilliant woman, and their son in a perfect, unending light. "The first house was built for a dream," Elias whispered into her hair, his eyes reflecting the sunset and the beautiful reality standing right beside him. "But this one, Joe, this one we built for forever."